Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Every Drop Matters, an event that blends music, sound and film with research community projects to raise awareness about one of the greatest challenges of the 21st century, water security. 1 in 10 people around the world, around 800 million, do not have access to clean water. And by 2025, half the global population will live in countries with high water stress. From rural sub-Saharan Africa to the megacities of the world, there's a global water crisis and prospect of water wars. Our panel of speakers this evening will highlight some of the key issues, from water scarcity and flooding caused by climate change and glacial melt, to inequality of access to safe water, the need for coordinated management of urban water, and the intricacies of transboundary agreements and diplomacy in shared water sources. We'll also hear about some unique creative collaborations between composers, filmmakers and researchers that have produced dramatic soundscapes, such as you've heard, to get audiences reflecting on the connection between climate change and global water security, as well as their own water consumption habits. As you were arriving, you heard Earth Flow, composed in response to research recounting stories of climate change along the Gandiki River in Nepal. It focuses on themes of erosion, landslides and glacial melt, and includes field recordings of wind, water, landslides and rivers, paired with compelling video footage. This is just one example of the type of projects facilitated by our first speaker this evening, Elise Schultar, who is the Communications and Knowledge Exchange Manager for REACH programmes. This is a research programme led by the University of Oxford to improve water security for 10 million people affected by poverty in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Elise is also a documentary photographer using photography as a tool to communicate environmental, water and climate research. Alice has worked closely with our second speaker this evening, Kayena Ponchioni-Bailey, who uses orchestral music to promote social justice and environmental sustainability through the arts. She's currently Director of Research at the Oxford Conducting Institute and holds a Leverhulme Research Fellowship at the University of Sheffield to write a book on orchestras in Afghanistan. Kayena will share her experiences from the collaboration with Oxford-based alternative band pecq, exploring how research and field imagery inspired their work and how music can be used to bring topical issues to a broader audience to help orchestrate behavioural change. We'll hear further excerpts from the project, a piece called Reaching Water, drawing on research from Ethiopia's Awash River Basin. Inspired by stories from local communities, this composition explores the increasingly long journeys faced by many people around the globe as climate change makes their access to water more difficult. Women and girls spend an estimated 200 million hours hauling water every day, time that is lost to education or income activities to improve their lives. The average woman in rural Africa walks 6 kilometres a day to haul around 18 kilograms of water. Rising global demands for water, population growth, increased agricultural demands to deliver food security, expanding urbanisation and climate change are some of the key drivers of water insecurity. Water availability is becoming more unpredictable as climate change influences the global water cycle, which we're seeing with the greater frequency and severity of extreme weather events. So what are the challenges to building capacity to avoid water security risks that are on the horizon as a consequence of climate change, water use behaviours and policy decisions? Social, cultural and political factors all play a role in developing long-term solutions, and we'll be tackling some of these issues this evening. To increase climate resilience, large urban areas will require a better coordination of surface and groundwater supply use, better management and governance of these precious resources. Our final speakers will explore this with case studies and personal experiences in India and in the Middle East. Our graduate student, Safa Fnayan, will share her research findings in riverine cities such as Guwahati in northeast India, which are focused on the risk of inadequate water supply, wastewater and sewage released into rivers, and urban floods. She's an Oxford Indira Gandhi Scholar at Somerville and at the Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development here, and the recipient of a National Geographic Explorer grant. Previously, Safa has worked with various development agencies to improve water security in South Asia. And concluding our event this evening with a global perspective on water politics, I'm delighted to welcome Hassam Hussain, who's freshly back from Jordan, who's a lecturer in international relations, a fellow in water diplomacy, and junior research fellow at Somerville. His research focuses on water policies for protecting shared water in the Middle East, on transboundary water governance, and on issues related to the political economy of water resources in arid and semi-arid regions. Hassam has also worked on issues of sustainable development and environmental governance for the Italian Embassy in Jordan, the European Parliament, and the World Bank and UNICEF. At the end of the presentations, we will have some time for questions before we hear a final soundscape, Reaching Water, and you're welcome to join us afterwards for further discussion over drinks. So Alice, may I hand over to you to tell us more about some of the challenges ahead and why improving water security is so important for climate resilience. Yes.
All right, welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you, Claire, for the introduction. So hope everyone is doing well. My name is Alice Chota, as Claire mentioned. I'm a science communicator and a photographer, and I currently work for the REACH program. And tonight I'll be talking about some of my work, some of the work I do communicating water security through photography in particular, but also through the arts and music. I'm not a musician, but this has come from collaboration with Kayena, whom you'll be hearing from later. So before I do so, I was asked to introduce the global water challenges, which is no small task. Claire has already done a good introduction, but because I'm a photographer, I always like to start with images. So what I did yesterday when I was starting to prepare my presentation was to do a simple search on Google Image for the water crisis. And some of the images that came up in the search are probably a lot of the images we think about when we hear about the water crisis. So often we think about poor women and children struggling to access water in drought-ridden landscapes, most often Africa, sometimes Asia. And this has a lot of truth to it. Africa is one of the most impacted continents by global water issues, and women and children are some of the most vulnerable groups affected by water security, and we know that climate change will continue to impact these challenges. But I think it's also really important to widen our lens. Water security challenges actually affect the whole globe, and they go much beyond access to water and water scarcity. So what I thought I would do is to go through the news just from over the past few months to give you a flavor as to what the number of water challenges that exist globally. So I'll start with floods in China that affected millions of people and displaced 2 million people in Shaanxi province. And even closer to home, we may remember the floods in Europe that affected loads of people, killed hundreds almost of people, and particularly affecting Germany. And we know that these extreme events, floods, droughts, and more will continue to increase due to climate change. The IPCC predicts that one of the strongest impacts of climate change is through the water cycle. So what does this mean? Well, we know that certain geographies will be most heavily impacted, for example, Africa, as I mentioned earlier in the talk. But this will have impact trickling in every part of the world, really. Much closer to home, this is a headline from just about a month ago, actually. There's been research that was led in Oxford about the water quality issues, and they found that right after heavy rainfall, water quality in Oxford was much worse due to sewage pollution, making some popular bathing spots unsafe. And we know that climate change will increase these extreme rainfall events. Talking about water quality, there's lots we can talk about here, and I won't get into detail, but I've briefly talked about sewage pollution. We can talk about arsenic, that is a major issue here in India, but also in Bangladesh and in a lot of places in Asia. We can also talk about industrial pollution in growing cities, and there's much more to talk about from a water quality perspective. I want to bring this one because oftentimes when we think about access to water, issues in low and middle income countries come to mind, but there's also huge discrepancies in access to water amongst different groups within higher income countries. So this is highlighting the discrepancy in access to water between indigenous groups in the Americas and the rest of the population. So I thought this was something very important to flag, and often that isn't in the consciousness. talking about water, we can't divide it from talking about energy. So this is a news from Brazil and Paraguay, Latin America. And then we also can't divide it from politics, how water can lead to can lead to conflict. This is something that Hussam will be talking about later. This is the Grand Renaissance Dam across the Nile. So Hussam will be talking to us more about water politics. So this is just a few news I picked up from the past few months to highlight that water issues span much beyond water scarcity and water access. And they really span all across the globe. But I do want to highlight that some geographies are more affected by others, and some groups are certainly more affected by others. So this is just a few slides to set the stage. What I will do now is talk about two projects that I've been working on over the past few years. One is an independent project, and the other one is as part of the REACH program. And my interest in general is to work with scientists to communicate their research using photography, but also additional collaboration, for example, with musicians. Both of these projects have actually led to collaboration with Kayena and the band pecq. So the first video you saw was inspired by the Himalayas to Ocean project, and the last one that you will hear is from the second project in Ethiopia. So the first project is called Himalayas to Ocean, and the aim was very much to work with scientists, or to work with scientists to communicate the science around climate change using images, film, sound recording, and music. And the idea was to travel from the peaks, so I don't know if you can see the mouse here, the peaks in the Himalayas in the north all the way to the floodplains of Nepal, and along the way collecting stories of how climate change is affecting water security and therefore people's lives. And the aim was very much to show that climate change isn't just about melting glacier. There's much more that is going on there. So I'll just take you through a very few images. There's lots more you can explore, and as I said, this project has led to a few different collaboration, musical and artistic collaboration. But I'll just show you a few images to give you a flavor. So we know that mountains are warming fast and faster than the global average. And the Himalayan region on its own, or warming in the Himalayan region has doubled over the past decade. So this is happening very fast. And for me, this image really illustrated this fact. This is on the top left, you can see Nilgiri Peak at 7,000 meters in altitude, and further back, this is the Annapurnas at over 8,000 meters in altitude. And when I was there taking the image, I really thought to myself, this is incredible how little snow there is left. And this resonated a lot with some of the stories we collected along the way. This is Nilgiri Peak at 7,000 meters in altitude, and a lot of the local communities would point at this mountain in front of us, and they would say, the mountain used to be covered in snow, and now we can increasingly see the dark patches. So the next stories revolve around landslide. This is in the mid-hills of Nepal. And landslides are a common occurrence in Nepal, but we know they will be made more frequent because of climate change, because of the excessive, erratic and extreme rainfall that it's causing. This will lead to even more casualties. This image was taken in the mid-hills of Nepal, where an entire village was collapsed and the population was displaced. It's also causing more floods, and these are some of the issues that are highlighted in the first video, in the pecq and Kayena's video that you saw at the start. Moving further down in the mid-hills of Nepal, where the landscapes changes a lot, you see it's much more humid, it's much more lush, and yet you still have a very mountainous or hilly geography. And here we highlighted the impacts of climate change and water security on women in particular, who are responsible for both collecting water for drinking water, but also agriculture, because a lot of the men actually go abroad to work. This is one of the women we interviewed who spends about 3-4 hours a day collecting water. Because of the hilly terrain, she has to go down the valley and then back up. And finally, we spend time in the floodplains of Nepal, where the issues here are around flooding. And again, flooding is a common occurrence in this part of Nepal, but they will be made more frequent because of extreme rainfall that are accelerated by climate change. And I don't know if you can see well, but here we interviewed a woman who lost her home, and this is a shelter that was rebuilt. And for me, what was very striking is, she said that she's very aware that these events will continue to happen, and heavy rainfall is happening more frequently, but she has nowhere else to go. And this is highlighting really the difference in coping mechanisms. Some people will be able to cope better than others. So it's also highlighting the difference between different groups. So this is from the Nepal project. Second, I want to talk to you about this project I've been working on in Ethiopia. I've been collaborating with Dr. Catherine Gresham, who's also part of the REACH program. She's a social researcher working in this area of rural Ethiopia. And I traveled with her in 2018 to take images to document her research and to show the diversity of ways that climate change and water security issues are interlinked. Ethiopia is one of the poorest and most affected country by water security issues and climate change. And there's a huge discrepancy between rural areas and urban areas. The latest joint monitoring program report by UNICEF and WHO states that only 5% of the population, the rural population, has access to safely managed water, whereas this is close to 40% in urban areas. So there's a huge discrepancy. And what we did here is that we spent time in this quite small area, but we wanted to highlight different issues that are in different areas. So Harukersa in the north is a very dry landscape, it's a rural district. Then Metehara in red is a town, small town next to a big lake. And then we have Gola just under, which is another rural district. And so I won't spend much time here. I just have a few images I took. The top two are from Harukersa, which is, as I mentioned, is a very dry, arid landscape, and many of the issues revolve more around access to water, failing infrastructure, and really how that is being accelerated with climate change. This is to highlight the issues around the town, and I just wanted to choose one image, so I picked this one. It's obviously not showing an urban landscape, but it's the lake that is next to the city. That lake has been expanding, and it's been encroaching on the water supply infrastructure. So this has been causing issues within the town. And the last one is an image from the Gola district, which is itself facing a lot of flooding issues. And here this is an image of Mohammed in front of his crop that just a few months ago was completely inundated. So he lost all of his crops. So just a few images to give you a flavor. But one of the reasons I wanted to bring these up is because these images made me think a lot about the process of taking photographs, and especially being a foreigner, questioning myself, am I the right person to take these images? And would they look differently if they were taken by the community themselves? Do the aesthetics matter to communicate? And is it okay for a foreigner to take images? And this led to a follow-up project that I co-led with Catherine, where we trained some of the community members from those areas to take photographs and document their own stories in those two districts. And this was a wonderful project. We worked with Ethiopian humanitarian photographer Martha Tedesse, who did the trainings. And it was fantastic what we collected. We collected loads of images, and I'll just show just a very few. For me, what it showed is the complexity and the diversity of issues that we might not have picked up, and I might not have been able to capture myself. So this is, I don't know if you can see well with the colors, but this is a woman bathing in polluted water. You have here a mother and collecting unsafe water with her children. And those two on the right relate to flooding. So you have, this is a family that has lost their homes, because of flooding, and this is a shelter where they're now living. And here is infrastructure damaged by flooding. And then in the Harukersa district, I've just highlighted 4 here. You probably can't see very well, but on the top there, you can see women collecting water from these basins with stagnant water, obviously health damaging. And on the top right, why I like this image is because you can see men, and oftentimes when we see images of water, it's often a woman at a hand pump or a woman collecting water. But here we can see it's highlighting some of the responsibilities that men have around water, which is mainly around taking cattle to drink water. Here on the bottom left, are cattle that are drinking from water that is actually contaminated by a factory. And the last one, maybe it's not particularly striking, but for me it says a lot, because for part of the year, the community has to travel. They travel for days, and they get to a river to have access to water because the landscape becomes so arid, and they leave the children and the elderly behind. So we had a few stories that I would never have managed to capture, because those cameras traveled with the population that was migrating, and they stay there for weeks. So we managed to get access to all those different stories, and these are some of the participants. We organized with them an exhibition with local decision makers and some NGOs to share back their stories to those decision makers. So we felt this was a wonderful opportunity for them to share their own stories, and also for the decision makers to better understand the diversity of water issues. And we were hoping that this would build trust between the decision makers and the community. And we're still collecting. We collected information through surveys, so we're still going through that now. So this is just to give you a flavor of, I just want to say finally, well, just to conclude that I think participatory photography and participatory work in general can be very effective, but it still led many questions around, well, actually in the end, is it actually going to change something for the community? They devoted a lot of their time and energy to collect these images. They probably have high expectation of what's happening next. And this is the fear, is that, will anything actually change for them? So this is something for us to reflect on. This is the end of my presentation, and I'd just like to end with this quote that I read in this book that I highly recommend by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine Wilkinson. To change everything, we need everyone. What this moment calls for is a mosaic of voices, the full spectrum of ideas and insights for how we can turn things around. For me, this is a reference to involving everybody, from the decision makers all the way to the communities, and using a diversity of tools, from science to the arts, and more. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elise, and thank you all for being here today. Claire, that was a fantastic introduction to the entire evening, and I really appreciated all of the things, the context you gave for the piece that we just heard. So as Claire said at the beginning, my name is Kayana Ponchoni Bailey. I'm a researcher actually in the social psychology of orchestral performance, but either as my day job or as my kind of moonlighting job, I'm also an orchestral conductor, and my passion is really about finding ways to leverage orchestral performance to address issues of social justice and environmental sustainability, both within orchestral practice but through orchestral practice. So I'm just going to play a short clip. So I'll be spending time today talking about this project, which follows on directly from Elise's presentation of those two works, the two projects that she was just describing, an orchestral commissioning project that engages with researchers and the research of both of those projects. I think that, so it's my own kind of personal conviction that everybody has to do everything, or to change everything, it requires everybody. And orchestras, just like other civic institutions and cultural institutions, have a responsibility to address climate change through their work. And music and orchestral performance has some unique opportunities. One, it's a forum for bringing people together, creates a platform for being able to have these discussions. It allows for interdisciplinary collaboration with other art forms, but also with research. It is a place for people to reflect, so it has a temporal element to it that perhaps isn't so much about presenting evidence as it is presenting ideas and emotional components to those ideas, which allow people to engage with them on their own terms. And indeed, we know that music really has a capacity to evoke emotions, and as Claire said at the beginning, that's one of those things that's part of the puzzle in motivating people to take change in their own lives. So, so this project, We Are Water, is a collaboration between myself and this alt pop band, pecq, which is really made up of two individuals. One, Hannah Jacobs, who is an Oxford alum from the music department. She's a keyboardist, a songwriter, a singer, and composer. And Nicholas O'Brien, who is a percussionist and does a lot of you probably saw in the first film there, kind of creating his own DIY electronics. He does a lot of sound engineering, and was on the Himalayas to Ocean expedition, which was an interdisciplinary expedition in which he collected a lot of field recordings, which were used in that composition. Both of the projects I'm talking about as part of We Are Water were facilitated entirely by Elise. I mean, this is, Elise as the connector, the science communicator, has been absolutely essential. So We Are Water, our grand plan is to have 4 compositions, electroacoustical or electro-orchestral, I tend to say, compositions commissioned from me of pecq. For orchestra and their band, and each one will engage with kind of a different geographical area and on a topic of water security. I personally have been really passionate about water throughout my life. I come from an area in which it's very common for people to need to haul water. It's not an area that is necessarily water scarce, although Central Alaska is or has been technically a desert, but it is the way that people live. For example, there wasn't really a possibility to have a well on our property because of the way that the land was organized. So I've always been quite personally invested in being aware of water. So the 2 pieces that have been written thus far, have been performed and have been recorded, are Earthflow, which you heard at the beginning, and which drew on the Himalayas to Ocean project and the concept of landslides. And in fact, what Hannah did with that particular piece is the orchestral bit, in addition to the soundscape that Nico brought in. The orchestral bit really draws on the molecular scientific background of landslides. As she got into that research, she was really quite fascinated by that. So all the bop beep, bop beep, bop beep, are kind of the ways in which water molecules change. I'm going to get the science wrong, so I'll stop talking, but that's where that came from. The second one, Reaching Water, was inspired by the work of Dr. Catherine Grasham and Elise in Ethiopia, in the Fentale district, and in particular, what Elise was finishing with, that sense of journey. So when pecq got together with Catherine, with Elise, to discuss and to look at some of the interviews of their participants in the Fentale district of Ethiopia, they were really struck by that journey from starting out in these arid, dry landscapes to the process of finding water, using water, and then returning home. So this composition actually documents that to an extent, or tries to evoke that. And I'm going to play just, these are the five stages of this, and you can see on the right the photography that Elise was sharing earlier, and they actually kind of a little bit upside down. I'll explain why, which is down at the bottom. Elise very kindly paired these chapters with some images from their research, and so the journey starting at the home. There's a section of Mirage where you can hear the different kind of distortions of sound that Nico and Jakes are doing. Sighting the river and then accessing the river, which becomes actually quite joyous music, and is related here to this upper photo, and then the journey home. We'll hear the entire composition at the end, but just kind of give you a sense of those specific parts. I'll play you 2 excerpts. The image that you see here is Dira Boru, who is a farmer in the Fintali district, and it was from her interview in which she says in translation, let me just make sure, you have to travel long distances to find water. It is very tiring. And Hannah actually took that and her speaking that and inserted that into the composition, but also drew on that for some of the rhythmic material, which starts at this beginning. And before I play the second excerpt, I will say that part of our project, and this was all done within the lockdown, I say the lockdown, within the pandemic, the 2020 pandemic, part of the pandemic, we invited people from across the globe to send in water sounds. So to help make people aware about their own water consumption and the water around them, we invited them to record on their phones or whatever recording device, water in their area. It could be water in the bathroom, it could be water in a creek, it could be anywhere. And so we had all sorts come to us. I was actually pretty impressed that we got, I think, from Australia to Alaska. I mean, that was a given. I've got family. To places in Spain and to the southern part of the United States. People sending in these recordings, and all of them went into the second half of the composition. You won't hear them all in this next excerpt, but we come close to hearing some of them. All of that at the very end, just to say that we were very fortunate. These recordings did very well on Apple Music, Apple Play, on the streaming platforms, and they've been listened to over 20,000 times. So it really, that mobility, once music is recorded and can kind of have a life of its own, it's been really great to be able to reach a new audience. So thank you very much, and I hand the floor over to Safa.
To follow. I am going to move from the musical soundscapes to a bit of a messy chaos of urban water issues. And as you can see from this picture, it kind of depicts the rhetoric versus reality that is often experienced in growing cities of the global south. And I'll explain more about what each of these mean. And one of the questions that I kept asking myself during my field work is, does every drop matter over there? Some water is different from others. So riverine cities are cities that are growing on rivers. Oxford is a riverine city. But when you look at the Thames that runs through Oxford, it's a very different experience from the rivers that run through a lot of growing cities in the global south. Urban rivers definition is a little bit broader. Urban rivers are the rivers that have been folded into the process of urbanization, and often they move beyond the city because consequences of the city flow downward and are felt everywhere, both upstream and downstream. You're drawing water upstream for the city, polluting it, that goes downstream. And what is the global south? Many of you might have heard it. And I'm going to read what Bahan et al. 2019 had mentioned about the global south. It often, we equate it with a metaphor for underdevelopment, but more often what global south really refers to, and I'm going to read it so I don't paraphrase, it references an entire history of colonialism, neo-imperialism, and differential economic and social change, through which large inequalities, and this part is important, through which large inequalities in living standards, life expectancy, and access to resources are maintained. And this second part is experienced even in developed countries. So it's global south does not necessarily only refer to developing countries, as we so call it. And this is actually a river that flows through this city in Guwahati. And some of the challenges that one faces as you go to study this, the starting one is theoretical assumptions that are prevalent in literature, because dominant urban studies has been happening for the longest time in the developed context. Urbanization started early on from the developed context. So right now, less than 20% of urban research comes from the global south. And the problem with this is it carries assumptions within theory, assumptions of how decentralized governance is a good form, assumptions of data availability, assumptions of what might be very considered basic, like democratic deliberations within governance processes. And these all transfer to the global south. And what happens is that the theory does not necessarily match reality. And oftentimes it becomes like a hexagon is being tried to shoved into a circle cog. It'll fit if you push it hard enough, but there will be loads of gaps. A challenge also is historical continuity. Oftentimes when you study a region, you study it from that particular snapshot. And what happens is you forget all of the past trajectories. These overlaying structures of governance that form over time, creating this governance complexity. So at the end of the day, you have this overlay of errors, and it comes up with this mix of responsibilities from different people. So at the end of the day, everyone is responsible and no one is responsible for addressing water risks. And then you have infrastructure. What you see over here are not bamboo shoots. Those are actually pipes running through. Those are water supply pipes. These lines, here, that is not a route, that's a pipeline. And so these pipe systems create their own feedback and challenges, which we often don't see or don't consider. And then there's also this normalization of risk. If you're in a hot water bath and the water gradually gets hot, you don't realize when it gets very hot. And this is what has been happening with a lot of river pollution. These rivers have been flowing and gradually becoming so polluted that now it's so normal to consider them as sewers. They're not looked as rivers anymore. Actually, even when you talk to government officials, they call them drains. And what happens? There's spillover risks. So this leads to water supply contamination, shortages because of quality problems. Because these rivers are getting clogged, your rivers are like your arteries in your arteries and veins in your body. These get clogged, there are floods happening everywhere, also added climatic uncertainty. As Elise was mentioning, it adds up. And then there is also river pollution. And again, this is a river. This is not a drain. And so now we move on to my research area, which is Guwahati. It's a small city. It's not, I'd like to think it's special, but it's not very special. It's one of these many smallish, growing, medium-sized cities in India that don't receive much attention. So it's a lot of the problems that would be faced in this city are similar to a lot of riverine cities in India. And the risks that I'm assessing are floods. This is actual flood situation in that city. I wasn't here, but. And their water supply. What you ideally think, water supply when you think in Oxford is you turn on your tap, and that's where water comes from. But in a lot of developing contexts, people who move, water supply also comes from these drinking water tankers. Oops, yeah. And that on top is also a river. It's not a park. Guwahati also, this is like a graph to show the red dot is Guwahati, how it's similar to other cities in its growth, urban growth and expansion. And now I'm going to tell you of the story of Guwahati, how it has been growing and what are the changes that you've been facing. It started out, my research, I mean it's a very old city, but my research starts from 1970s when it became a capital of the city. It got a little bit more structured in its governance forms. This is the yellow line is the border of the city, and the wider thing is the metro region. The blue spaces are the wetlands, and the blue dots, if you can see, are the rivers. And I want you to keep in mind these blue dotted lines. These are the rivers that also flow between the city, and that's the big river. What happens over time is that these spaces start to shrink, and as an infrastructure measure, these rivers start to get connected because it's flooding, you want to drain the flood as fast as possible. So a river channel gets connected to that floodplain. As the city starts to expand and grow more, the city boundary changes. You see these blue dotted lines increase more and more, and that is more so to improve, as government officials call it, drainage of the city. So you create more and more canals, you pave them so the water can flow as fast as possible. This is dehumanizing the nature of the river, and it is no longer a river. And then as you see now, there is so much more connection. The wetlands have been dissected, interspersed, shrink to a lot of level. That side wetlands have totally gone. They've all been taken over by urbanization. And now, because data is also a very big problem, getting historical data is very challenging. So what you do is I assessed rainfall patterns and the river flow patterns, and then overlaid it with news reports of floods in the city, urban floods. And if you see, there is no specific pattern in how the floods occur. Sometimes it's because of very high rainfall, sometimes it's because the rivers are overflowing because of upstream, oftentimes it's both. And so there has been more dispersed flooding, but as you can see over time, even though infrastructure has increased a lot, the flooding recurrence has also increased a lot. So what is that infrastructure really doing? I mean, it might be doing a lot of things, but there is also a consistent increase in the flooding. And flooding is also a social thing. It does not necessarily always correlate to rainfall patterns. Can be a same rainfall pattern as before, but because of urban development, the water accumulates higher. So it's a flood created. Since I'm also looking at water supply issues, I was looking at, so this is tap, well, hand pump, tube well, other sources total, and the other side is how the groundwater situation is decreasing over time, because while tap is public supply, it's your tap water that comes in, and it comes from the city and it comes from the river. your well, your hand pump, and your bore well are all groundwater. And the dependence on this groundwater has increased over time so much more than the tap water, if you look at it cumulatively. So these are the physical risks that are increasing and changing over time. There should be regulation that governs it, right? This is how the diversity of actors are increasing. So I quantified it. Who's responsible? What are they doing? How are they connected to each other? And which issues are they working with each other? So what you need to look at is these three bottom things. We have the national, we have the state, and we have the local actors. And the next one will show how they map together. And this is where the chaos truly comes in. This is how in 1970s to 1975, these are all of the people responsible for governing water supply, flood issues, and issues linked to river pollution. The blue lines are water supply, the green is flood, and the orange is river pollution. So in 1970 to 1979, you see it's water and floods more often. Then between 1980 to 1989, it's still a similar pattern. Then between 1990 to 1999, it exploded a bit because a lot of neoliberalization, decentralization, a lot of actors came in, and it got even more complex. Much more people came in. You will see some actors that are more responsible, some actors not so responsible. And it gets messier as it goes along. And it gets even more messier. But one thing that's distinct is it's creating its own spheres. So it's creating like kind of specialization. You see all the blues coming aside, you see all the greens moving aside, you see all the oranges moving away. The greens coming together are all of the people who are working on the floods, the blues are all of the people working on infrastructure issues, and the oranges are all of the people working on river pollution issues. And what you might find interesting over here is as water supply issues are usually infrastructure, all of these pipes and all of that. And in this time you can see corruption, dots like corruption coming up also, because that was also one of the themes that came up as I studied these. And all of this data was gathered from newspapers, so it's what's actually happening. Concerns also changed over time. If you see people are looking at operation maintenance, planning, funding, these are all of the issues that the governments are looking at. What does all of this mean for the city and for other cities? Is that there's always this tug of war. In theory, it says that more different people coming together for a specific risk, specific people, specific responsibilities, they do better. But what we're seeing is that there is a tug of war. There is power, because also funding, it's messy. There is funding from one side, there is implementation, another guy, and then the final guy does different things himself. Infrastructure does not adequately always address risks. Water supply is a constant ongoing concern. River pollution, sometimes it is, if you talk to the government officials, they're like, it's not a problem, the river is big enough, it'll absorb everything. The newspapers have increasingly started to calling it cesspool of filth. This is a direct quote from the newspapers. Urban floods, there are mitigation plans after every urban flood. Some people die, they were like, oh, we're gonna fix this. They fix it, but then government changes, people change, those plans start to tank. Again, then there's climate uncertainty, another flood happens, a new plan gets created. People love plans. So what does it map? What are the implications for the future as we think about future decision making, as we think about future plans? Again, they love plans because new plans means new infrastructure, means new funding. And so there's always, one of the things that I noticed is that water supply is going to be a consistent issue, because as people increase, needs and demand increases. Floods is also going to be an ongoing issue because urban development is paving things, it's changing the dynamics of the city. But there is so these two have plateaued in how they're changing. But there is a steep rise in river pollution, and until and unless we take very specific and very immediate action against it, the river pollution is consistently going to increase, because as urban development grows, as more water consumption grows, and there is no mechanism. All of this is going directly into our rivers. And what is interesting is these rivers are also source for your drinking water supply that comes back into the city. And again, conservation. I showed you the wetlands and how they're being eaten away. Urban development is spreading out at such a fast pace, so there is this constant tug of war. You have the rhetoric that conservation is important, conserve water, but you also have, we need to build more, we need space, we need land. And policy engagement is like, as academics, as people who are working on policy, you always make policy briefs, policy recommendations, but who does it go to? Because different people are doing different things, and at every level, things are being changed. So there is funding that comes from the national level. You have implementation decisions, not implementation, but the decisions of what needs to be done and where will money go at a state level. And finally, the local actors who are doing things are the ones who get charged with all of these responsibilities and have a narrow room to circumnavigate decisions and change things, but their wiggle room is very narrow. And there's like urban theory, a lot of it. There's difference between the reality of it and the theory. So there needs to be a kind of reconcile happening over there, because we can't have more and more changes in this. It needs to come together at one point. And there is this centralized, the idea is that smaller, decentralized infrastructure will be better, it will be more resilient. But what is happening in this case is everything is coming together. Mega projects are being the new thing. So how do we reconcile this difference? Theory, recommendations say decentralization, small, but what is actually happening in the city is bigger is better. So how do we reconcile these two is something also that needs to be considered. And this is an actual photograph from the government offices, and these are files, and a lot of these are recommendation reports.
Thank you, Claire, for organizing and for inviting. So my name is Usam Hussain. I'm from the Department of Politics and International Relations, and therefore I'm going to be looking at water more from another perspective, more of a political and international relations perspective. So the challenge around water, when water resources are transboundary, which means shared between countries. So basically about water, I mean, we already heard a lot today about water, but 97% of water resources in the world are salty. And only 3% of the water is fresh water. Of this fresh water, slightly over 2/3 are frozen and in glaciers and in polar ice caps. And therefore, we only have a limited amount of water that is fresh water in the form of rivers or groundwater resources. And of this fresh water that we can use, about 60% is transboundary, so shared between countries. When it comes to water politics or hydropolitics, what do we mean? We might think of different things depending on our field of expertise or where we come from. But for instance, here we have 3 pictures. I have only 3 or 4 pictures, so not many pictures in this presentation compared to my previous, the other speakers. But here we have 3 examples of water politics. In the first one, we have a dam. So when a dam is constructed, we might have local communities protesting against the construction of the dam, or the dam might generate some politics and protest from other countries sharing the same river, as for instance the GERD, the dam in Ethiopia, is generating in the downstream countries in Sudan and Ethiopia, and Egypt, sorry. In the second picture, we have a demonstration of local people, here indigenous people, protesting against the privatization of water resources. They say water for people, not for profit, so against the commodification of water resources. Instead, in the third picture, we have head of states and of government coming together from different countries to sign an agreement on how to manage the water resources of the Indus in this case. So water politics can really mean different things depending on our field of expertise. Or the academic field we come from. However, coming from international relations, for me, hydropolitics means the study of water, conflict, and cooperation over shared water resources, over transboundary river basins or groundwater resources. And so the focus is really on trying to understand how the water resources is divided and allocated between countries. So who gets what water, how, and which kind of water, and how the process of allocating and managing and the water resources works. Why it matters? I mean, we already say that 60% of the global freshwater resources are transboundary in their nature. About 40% of the world's population lives within transboundary basins. And then 2/3, I mean, focusing myself on the MENA region, so the Middle East and North Africa, 2/3 of surface water resources in the Arab world originates outside of the Arab region. SDG, so the Sustainable Development Goal 6 is the one that focuses on water, but in particular, 6.5.2 focuses on transboundary water cooperation, trying to push countries to sign agreements with neighboring countries on how to manage their shared water resources. So promoting water cooperation. We probably heard, many of us, we read about water in the newspapers, and many headlines, especially in the past, focused on water wars and the risk for water wars in this century, saying that water will be the reason why countries will go to war, especially in the 21st century, water seen as the blue oil, and often referring to case studies from the Middle East and North Africa or Southeast Asia as probably likely hotspot for wars in this century. Those are usually arid and semi-arid regions. We have, for instance, the Nile Basin, and Alice mentioned earlier the dispute between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt on the GERD, but also along the Jordan River, which is shared between Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. Another example is the Tigris and Euphrates, but also the Mekong, for instance, is another case that is often mentioned as places where we might have wars. And usually these narratives and discourses about wars, water wars, emphasize climate change as reducing water resources, so increasing water scarcity, increasing demand due to population growth, and all these factors leading to degradation of water resources and fight between countries to allocate these scarce and growing scarce water resources. However, research from the Oregon State University showed that instead, in the past at least, when it comes to interactions between countries over shared water resources, it's more likely to have cooperation. So they had this unicum line that shows that on the left we have, the examples of conflicts over shared water resources in the past. And on the right we have cooperation. And one of the, +6 is treaties and agreements over shared water resources. So countries coming together and signing agreements. And we have 157 examples in the past about 50 years. So basically what they proved was that in the past, and history shows that it's more likely to have positive interactions over shared water resources. And we never had a war that was fought only over water. So basically, conflicts can be also fought over water resources, but usually water has never been the only reason, or the main reason why we had a conflict over shared water resources. The London Water Research Group instead tried to emphasize that we can have conflict and cooperation over shared water resources. So it's not that if we have an agreement, we have solved the problem and therefore we don't have conflicts over that river. In fact, basically what they say is that while we can have cooperation, such as an agreement between countries, we can also have conflict because the agreement itself can be the reason why we have conflicts. We can think of an agreement that it's not fair to all those that are involved, or an agreement where not all the countries in the basin are involved and therefore not all the countries have signed it, or an agreement that is not implemented or not fully implemented or respected by one of the parties, usually the most powerful one. And so having an agreement or cooperation is not enough. The important thing is to try to increase the cooperation and try to decrease at the same time the conflict over that shared water resources. Professor Tony Allen from King's College London try to explain why we never had a war over water resources in the Middle East, which is the most water scarce region in the world. And basically his point was that we never had a war because when countries run out of water, which happened already back in the 70s, what happened was that they allocated more water to domestic uses, so for drinking purposes mainly, and they reduced the water for agriculture, and instead they imported water in the form of agricultural goods, so virtual water, which is basically water embedded in any amount, in any good or service. So basically, as you can see, producing beef requires more water than producing tea, for instance, and therefore a water scarce country is more likely to import more meat from abroad instead of producing it itself in their country. So my field of, I mean, the debates and my field of research and academic literature trying to understand who gets water, try to look at whether international water law can explain who gets the water. But I mean, we have the UN Convention of 1997, which gives us three very important principles underlying and guiding allocation of water resources. There are no significant harm, prior notification, and equitable and reasonable utilization. But as you can see, they're quite flexible in their interpretation, and then, I mean, some countries would emphasize one rather than the other. For instance, when it comes to the GERD, so the Nile Basin and Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt would emphasize the importance to consider the no significant harm. So Egypt has always had used most of the water resources of the Nile, and therefore maintaining the historical uses and the current allocation of water resources means not creating significant harm to Egypt. However, Ethiopia would emphasize the need for equitable and reasonable utilization of the water resources of the Nile Basin, and therefore they would argue that the agreement signed in the 50s, in 1959, between Sudan and Ethiopia, that says that between Egypt and Sudan, that says that Egypt will have 85% of the water resources of the Nile, and Sudan only 15%, is not fair, and it's not inequitable, and it's not reasonable, and therefore these allocations needs to be rethought and redistributed. Therefore, these two principles, are used differently by different countries. This framework tries to explain how water resources are allocated between countries in a basin. And basically they say that there's three different aspects that we need to consider, which here are the three pillars. First one is the riparian position. So if a country is upstream, it's more likely to have a say in how much water should flow to the downstream countries. However, this is not enough, because if you think of the Nile or also the Jordan River, we have a situation where the downstream country has been using most of the water resources. So Israel on the one hand and Egypt on the other. So we also need to consider the other two. If we look at the last one, is exploitation potential. So to what extent the country has the capacity, has the infrastructure, has the engineers to be able to use the water resources. So the river flows in the country, but has the country the capacity to pump the water out of the river and make use of it? We can think, for instance, of the Mekong River, which is shared between different countries, but also between Laos and China. Obviously, China has more exploitation potential than a smaller country such as Laos. Thirdly, and probably most importantly, is power. So which one is the most powerful country? And basically these scholars argue that the most powerful country is the country that will be able to use most of the water resources. And then they also look at different types of power, so hard power, which is military power, economic power, but also more soft types of power, so power in negotiations, bargaining power, or also the power of changing discourses and trying to change how people think and perceive the problem or the river. So if we think of the Nile, we would probably all think of Egypt as one of the countries, and not many people would think of the other 10 countries sharing the Nile. So this is really part of this soft power, so power of changing ideas, power of changing perceptions about something. So we saw the challenges around sharing water between countries. But now we also see in the last 3 slides how we can try to solve problems and increase cooperation and try to decrease conflicts over shared water resources. So there is this new field of research that is called water diplomacy, and basically what they argue is that we need to try to increase, so making the pie bigger. So not really thinking only about the water resources themselves when negotiating, but also try to look at other services that can be generated from water resources. So we need to discuss and negotiate water resources, obviously, but also new waters. So countries can discuss and negotiate new types of water, from treated wastewater or desalinized water. So we can have a package, an agreement that considers different types of water. We can also include issues such as urban and industrial development or environmental services. So, for instance, forestry or other types of services that can be generated and derived from the use of that water resource of the river. But also agricultural production. So maybe we can have a country using more water to produce agriculture, which then is traded amongst the countries of the basin. And finally, hydropower production and trade of this hydropower. So trying to arrive to a positive sum outcome of the negotiations by looking at making the pie bigger, and so a bigger share of the pie that can be allocated among all the riparian countries. Again, so hydropower, agricultural production, and environmental services are the ones that usually are discussed. This is a nice quote that says from Sedov and David Gray, who was a professor here in Oxford, that says a focus on sharing the benefits derived from the use of water rather than the allocation of water itself provides far greater scope for identifying mutually beneficial cooperative actions. And finally, we have an example here from the Levant, from the Middle East. So the lower part of the Jordan River, and in particular, this project that has been around for like 30 years or more, we probably have heard of it, is called the Red Sea, Dead Sea Canal Project, which is now operational, and they keep changing shape and the details of this project. But I think it's quite interesting because basically the idea is to try to desalinize water in Aqaba, so on the Red Sea in the south, and then pump part of the water to the Dead Sea, and then so part of the salty water to the Dead Sea, and then the desalinized water will be used by mainly Jordan, which require water, among the 3 countries, and then to Israel as well in the southern part. So, it has changed different times, but basically the idea behind this project is that it's a regional project that brings together Palestine, Israel, and Jordan to desalinize water, and there's different potential benefits of this project. One is new water, so desalinized water that can help especially Jordan in the northern part of the country, where most of the refugees and most of the population lives, and also Israel in the southern part of the country, which is the most desertic area of Israel. And then Israel would sell part of the water to the West Bank, where most of the water demand in Palestine is. So new water, saving the Dead Sea as well, which is decreasing by 1 meter per year, and interdependency, so the idea that peace can be, and which links with the last point, peace and stronger regional ties, taking and building on the idea of the origins of the European Union as well. However, challenges obviously are funding, because it's very energy intensive, trust between the 3 countries, which is one of the challenges in the past years, and that's why it keeps changing shape, relying on neighboring countries, especially for their own water security. Water obviously is a key sector, and so the question is always whether countries should maybe, the challenge between water and food security. So should countries keep using most of their water resources for food production, or maybe import more food from abroad back to virtual water, and instead keep their water resources for ensuring water security without the need to rely on neighboring countries. that's obviously very challenging and very political questions that the three governments are discussing. Yeah, and so we will see in the next years how this will develop. However, I think it's a nice example for what I was mentioning earlier on, trying to increase the pie and looking at the services linked to shared water resources and not only to water resources themselves. Great, that was my last question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.